so it's 2 o'clock. Yes, I understand this. Okay, welcome, everyone. I'm going to close this door. So I would like to sincerely welcome you all to this workshop on Europe in the world. Let me say a few words on why Europe in the world. And let me also explain to our international guests that this workshop is linked to some teaching themes and teaching activities that we have in this university, and that in particularly I carry out this semester. It is linked to a lecture series that is running at the same time, that is also called Europe in the World. So why is it useful? Why is it time, and especially in this place at Fulda, to reflect about Europe in the world? Just some introductory remarks before I start with the topic of my specific presentation. So one first reason is that in my faculty, the Faculty of Social and Cultural Sciences, we have 2 master programs, 2 international master programs. They both run either bilingually, German-English. One is devoted to intercultural communication and EU studies, and the other one is devoted to human rights in law, politics, and society. And for me, as a professor who mainly is employed for teaching, in teaching terms, for teaching European studies, it was really an opportunity to reflect upon the function of Europe in all this. So obviously you are trained as an EU scholar to know that human rights are very important, etc., etc. But really the fact to have a master program in European studies and to have so many international students forces one to adopt a worldwide outlook. That is one reason to do this in Fulda. The second reason is that Fulda is the place of the Fulda Gap. I mean, not really Fulda, but Geisa, where we have a research institute that we founded 2 years ago, is the place of the Fulda Gap. So Fulda is 30 kilometers from the former German border. And it's not only the German border, it's the former Iron Curtain. It is where the classical divide between the East and the West of the world was situated. It was a major hotspot of the Cold War. There was a military camp in Geisa, or close to Geisa, directly on the border, because it was a strategic hotspot. So it was a spot for a potential breakthrough from East to West, or from West to East, if it had come to a Third World War or something alike. So that's the reason why several researchers from Fulda University, together with other researchers from Erfurt University, now I think 3 years ago started the initiative to found a research institute at this place. It's the Point Alpha Research Institute, and the Point Alpha Research Institute is a co-sponsor and a co-organizer of this conference today. And Theresa Reinhold, who is sitting there, the blonde lady, she is currently a research fellow at the Point Alpha Research Institute. And Martin Utsch, you are still a research fellow, I think, until the end of December in the Point Alpha Research Institute. Yes, and the third reason, obviously, is that a lot of things are going on in the world in the moment, which is why we will have a roundtable this evening devoted to Europe in the world, and more particularly to European Union in the world, in the face of the ongoing wars. Yeah, there's a war of Russia against Ukraine still. When it started almost 2 years ago, everybody was hoping it would be over soon. It doesn't look like that. And there's a relatively recent war in the Near East between Israel and Palestine. And our question is not going to be like these wars in general, but we are going to ask this evening in the roundtable what these wars mean for the European Union. Because as most of you will know, the European Union is not exactly an institution that has some experience with wars. It's rather the opposite. It has been founded with the raison d'etat to be a peaceful actor. So there is a lot of challenges. This is why we are discussing Europe in the world. And the introductory presentation, it is entitled The Meanings of Europe. That's a topic I have been working on, among other things, in a book that I'll come to talk about rather soon. And this book dates back also almost 10 years. And I've come to rethink the questions that we wrote about in this book for the obvious reasons that you will see. So the following is devoted to the question of what is Europe and what are the different meanings of Europe. And okay, now it moves. Okay. And yeah, this is the book that you see. It's I co-edited it with my colleague Maike Schmidt-Klein. Changes and exchanges of a contested concept, the meanings of Europe. It has quite a number of chapters that look into the contested meanings of Europe. I've been continuing to be working on this, so part of the following is also based on this monograph about the EU as a democratic polity and how it has been contested. So my leading thesis is that Europe is an essentially contested concept. I'm going to talk about this in the first coming minutes. Then I will talk about the concept of Europe and how it relates to the European Union, because everybody knows, we all know it's not the same, but they are often equated. Then I'll ask what then are the meanings of Europe, and to end upon the relation of Europe, European integration, and European Union. Okay, what do I have to do? Okay, now. So, in the history of political thought and in historical debates, and that like really means history of ideas, historical debates, the concept of Europe is one that has been very present, but it has been essentially contested. There has never been, and there is no stable idea of what Europe is. That might seem surprising, but this is, I think, a very clear finding when you look at the history of ideas. Because any understanding of Europe is part of the struggle over contested meanings of contested concepts. And that means that if you try to define what Europe is, you enter into these contested meanings of contested concepts. Let me make this more explicit. There's first something that could be termed imaginary versus real Europe. So if we talk about an imaginary Europe, then we talk about one topic of our lecture series, the values, the ideas that are associated with the concept of Europe. So the question then would be, to what extent does Europe relate to a set of ideas or of conflicting ideas? Is it freedom and democracy, or is it nationalism and war? I might be adding colonialism here. So the question really is, what does Europe stand for, if it is a set of ideas? The question also is, to what extent Europe is a reality, and in what sense? And the question, I think, is more trickier than it seems, because we would obviously all say, of course, Europe is a reality. Really? Geographically, where does it start? Where does it end? Where it starts is easier to define because there is an ocean, but where it ends is really tricky to say. Regarding values, it's even more complicated. Regarding people, who would be the citizens of Europe? Regarding states, and regarding the European Union. That means that the concept of Europe has been contested throughout the centuries. It has been used for political purposes. It has been deliberately constructed with regard to strategies and interests. And just a footnote or a lookout or a cliffhanger for this evening's discussion, I would say that in both the wars that go on, and more specifically so in the Russian war against Ukraine, you see these constructions. So Europe really is associated with values, and in that case, it's liberal democracy. And there is a clear construction of another, and that would be Russia. I'm talking about the narratives about this war, but this war is not only a geopolitical war, it's not only a military war, it's also an ideological war. And you can see that it's a war where those opposing constructions are circulated as narratives. So The concept of Europe has frequently been marked by opposing constructions and contested meanings, such as war and peace. Sorry for the typo. Europe has been regularly associated with Enlightenment values, with liberty, but also with nation states and war. Especially the European nation states have a bloody history. They have a colonial history. They are based on ideas that oppose the Enlightenment ideal of the individual of liberty, at least to a certain extent. So heroism, masculinism, war. As I said, so the history of the European nation states is very bloody and is not really in all always so enlightening. It becomes more complicated, I would say, but maybe also easier because we have some concrete element if we look at the relation of the concept of Europe and the European Union. And the EU today, that's the first thing to underline, is often used synonymously with Europe. So when people talk about Europe, I would say in 70% of the cases, they unconsciously speak about the European Union. But Europe should be doing. Whereas Europe is not identical to the European Union. As we see, we will have a session about enlargement tomorrow. Yeah, enlargement is concerning the question which states are going to be a member of the European Union. And there is a definition in the treaties saying that any European member state willing to become a member of the European Union can become a member under the condition that. But that doesn't resolve the definitory problem of where Europe starts and where it ends. As I said, to the west, it's relatively clear because there is an ocean that starts. But then, I mean, we had this question about which islands out in this ocean are belonging to Europe. And to the east, it's just territory. So it's really, really difficult to say where it ends. So the EU is in need of finding meanings, and it has been trying to construct these meanings ever since European integration started. So the European Union or the European integration process has always been about constructing meanings, about associating meanings, about saying Europe or the European Union stands for liberty, it stands for freedom, it stands for democracy. There's this one expression, for instance, just to name one, is the area of freedom, security, and justice. So who would not want to live in an area of freedom, security, and justice? These are very positive concepts. Reinhard Koselleck, a conceptual historian, would have termed these conceptual Vorgriffe. Yeah, so we are using a concept that has a very positive meaning in order to sell something to the citizens. And the area of freedom, security, and justice, well, to downgrade it a bit, it means cooperation in inner and security politics. So it means police cooperation, it means border protection, it means that kind of thing. Yeah, so I know a number of people who would question that this is about freedom and justice, what is happening there. So the EU purposefully has drawn ever since on ideas that are traditionally associated with Europe. Directly also, that means getting into their contested meanings. So contested meanings means that you have conceptual struggles. You are using a concept that might be contested, even essentially contested, that might be an empty signifier. You're using it in order to create an image, but you have a conceptual struggle. There is a kind of debate. There is sort of a conflict that might result from that. Then, to make things even more complicated, the EU is a new level of meaning to Europe. This is, I think, the take that I would say. We have new characteristics and new ideas added to the range of meanings that there used to be historically for Europe. Neoliberalism, market, anti-discrimination, EU citizenship. There are a number of new ideas that the European Union brings to the conceptual cluster of the ideas associated to the concept of Europe. And then there is something that is a kind of resurgent conceptual struggle in European integration. It's this realist idea of a balance of powers of European states versus a democratic federalist Europe. I'll speak about this a little at a later point in this presentation. So there are more questions than answers, actually. We could ask if there's some linearity noticed in the development of the meanings of the concept Europe. Whether the concept of Europe has been important in times of war or not. It's a very timely question. What about imperialism, nationalism, heroism as features of European states? So what does this tell us about the concept of Europe? Or is it really Europe as a territory of freedom and enlightenment? Is there a facility to integrate the other rather than to exclude it? Or is it both? And then the conceptual relations between Europe and the EU, also more questions than answers, probably. I mentioned that. Does the EU have implicit meanings? If so, what is it? In a project, a research project called Debating Europe that we carry out here, one finding is, very unsurprisingly, that the people we discuss with in focus groups would identify the EU to a large extent to freedom of movement, travel, the EU passport. So that's a kind of explicit meaning of the European Union. So the question is, how can we link today's conceptual struggles on the European Union, about the European Union and about Europe in the world, to what we know about the debate on the concept of Europe? And I would say it's really useful to look at previous debates about the concept of Europe and the historical perspectives. The main thesis that we had, accordingly, in this book, The Meanings of Europe, is that there is no essentialist definition of what Europe is. So maybe it's a continent. As I mentioned, it's not a clearly confined territory. It's not a people, it's not one language, it's not one culture. So our argument is that alterity is part of Europe's identity. It's about the losses and suppressions of certain past and simultaneous features. It's about steady transformation and self-differentiation. It's about processes of translation between the self and the other. It's about struggles of domination over the other. It's about an exclusion of the other. There were many others, non-European others, barbarians, immigrants, Orientals, etc. But Europe always triggered dreams to include the other, to establish a common ground for diversity. So on the one hand, Europe is the imperial drive to extend into the world and suppress the other. Europe became the world. And it is the other coming to Europe and becoming European by adding diversity to Europe as well as by expecting assimilation. So we suggested, I know that's very philosophical, but then not so philosophical, and it has a strong realist connotation to it. We suggested to see Europe as the relations and forms of exchange that it establishes. Mixing with others, translation from others, also domination and suppression of the others, but mainly exchanges between imagination, dreams, and institutions, between inhabitants, member states, and groups, an exchange with the world outside Europe, a potential of Europe to become, very important, what it is not yet, but maybe tomorrow. Europe as a power constellation and a dream, a utopia, an imagination, a fiction. And the geographical and cultural borders could be shifted to construct a concept of Europe that takes into account what it owes to others. So this is sort of what I would suggest would be a way to grasp what is Europe. Now, to become at least a little bit more concrete, what about the European Union and European integration in all this? So the EU as a polity, on one hand, has its roots in the idea to overcome earlier modernist thinking, namely nation states and wars. On the other hand, the EU has been characterized by reason, expert-based governments, and bureaucracy. Expertise has been one of the founding principles, and the EU is reputed to be a technocracy and for its democratic deficits. Nevertheless, the idea of European integration is an old utopia that in the course of centuries, and if I say centuries, I mean centuries. So I really mean modern, no, not the modern, but I mean medieval Europe. Medieval European thinkers such as Dante Alighieri, who have been conceptualizing a unified Europe. And high aiming goals were associated with it, such as a more peaceful and a more democratic Europe. There was a strong orientation behind European unification concepts. And today's European Union is an outcome. It has been driven by those ideas. It has been driven by conceptual struggles about how to implement those ideas, by manifold controversies regarding the character of the polity that was in the making. So we are not having a linear and straightforward unification process. This is, I think, also something very important when we reflect about Europe in the world. Besides the exchanges thing that I mentioned, it's, I think, very important to see that there's not one Europe and there is not a linear and straightforward way to proceed. I think it's really useful to rethink an important tradition in the history of political thought on the European integration process, and that's the federalist thought. Not even many EU scholars discuss federalist thinking, but I think in terms of rethinking what European Union is, it's really fruitful. So the Federalists are a movement founded in the cause of the resistance against National Socialism and fascism. They really developed like the real life concept of a united Europe for the years between 1940 and 1945, so the last years of the Second World War. They strongly gave a normative spin to unification concepts. They were arguing that a democratic European federation, which was overcoming the nation states and their negative sides, was the only way to make Europe progress in peace and freedom. So they really were, let's put it bluntly, fed up with wars, with Europe being devastated by wars, and they just said it would be nicer for everybody, it would also be more efficient, but let's stop waging wars. And they wanted to overcome the nation states, because for them, nation states were a major source of wars. So they really had strong normative principles. I think the human rights students should be listening closely now. The principles of the European Federation should be democracy, civil liberties and rights, pluralism, decentralization, federalism, and of course, human rights. Europe should be neutral. It should choose a third way in between a capitalist economy and a planned economy. Europe should be based on persons as opposed to the idea of isolated individuals. It should be based on a community as opposed to a totalitarian society. It should be based on difference, on different ethnicities and different cultural groups. Minorities would enjoy equal rights because every grouping would be valued by the federation. It would be the groups, importantly, and the European persons that would federate and not primarily the nation states. So it was a high-aiming normative ideal of a democratic supranational federation aiming at fundamental reforms of the state system. And I think if we talk about reforms of Europe, it's just useful to dive back into this history of ideas. So on the other side is the conception that then dominated the integration process. And I would briefly term it the balance of power conception. Driven by the heads of state and government of the newly peaceful European nation states, Churchill, Adenauer, de Gaulle. And very briefly, those guys won the battle in the institutions and they paved a way for the direction of European integration that was very much balance of power oriented. So you see some ideas of this very high-aiming normative ideal of a European federation in today's European Union, but it's strongly based on nation states still. The EU also has been based, and that's linked to the name of Jean Monnet, to what can be termed technocracy, or to take a more neutral term, on expertise and bureaucracy. So the founding fathers of the European Commission had a suspicion of citizens and of representative democracy because they were frightened of the irrationality of citizens and their will. So it's not really just a polemic, but there is a lot of truth in the finding that the EU has, since the beginning, had a depoliticizing and sometimes anti-democratic tendency. I read August Danielson's paper on my way here, and you are going to talk, I think, exactly about that. So the idea behind is not, how can I say that, not a mean one, but it's the belief in rationality. It's the belief that experts are the better governors because citizens don't have the knowledge. Yeah. Let me make a very nasty remark. I said this in another conference a couple of weeks ago. But if you have young climate activists saying, listen to science, then I think it's the same suspicion. Yeah, saying that citizens are just, you know, not getting it, and the scientists, the experts, the academics, they are getting it. And it's that very same idea that drove Jean Monnet and the like. Yeah, so on this basis and against this background of the real-life European integration process, I would argue that the EU reacts to the changing world order that you see currently as according to this expert-oriented way of governing. On one hand, the EU tries to govern complexity in and crisis. So 2 days ago, we had, as I said, someone from the European Council presenting, and he said that the European Council, since 3 years, governs in crisis mode. I don't know how many of my EU scholar colleagues knew that. I didn't know it. But he said they are, you know, taking decisions all the time. De facto, they govern the EU. De facto, they quasi-legislate the European Council, the heads of state and government, because one crisis follows another. There is a war, there is a pandemic, there is another war, there is financial problems, there is conflicts with Hungary and Poland. So they are sort of permanently in crisis mode. And they try to tackle challenges such as climate change or the pandemic or security challenges or new technologies or artificial intelligence as complex policy fields. And if you look at the patterns of reaction, they try to reduce or to control complexity, to depoliticize it. And just to give you an example of what I mean, the European Green Deal is a way to react to climate change. And it brought us, I think, mainly one thing, and that's the so-called taxonomy. And the taxonomy mainly is a bureaucratic monster. It's a classification of the effects of policies. So when you work in any public body, for instance, banks have to do it. They have to do a super bureaucratic classification of what will be the effects of any action. That's obviously sort of, it can be one way to say the effects of my action on climate change might be the following, but that probably as such won't change climate change. It just accumulates knowledge, and then it doesn't mean the way to act is changing. So in one respect, and regarding the challenges of a complex and ever more complex world and ever more complex and entangled problems, the EU tries to bring more expertise. On the other hand, when it comes to where I started, the values, the meanings of Europe in the world, the question how to act in the global order, how to position itself towards, for instance, all those new wars, the EU has to face more or less violently that business as usual no longer works. Let me take another example. So Olaf Scholz, our chancellor, went to Brazil a couple of months ago, and he wasn't received very well in Brazil. And one of my colleagues, he's not here today, Philip List, he's a professor of international relations and human rights. So Philip said, hey, come on, in my discipline, so critical IR, legal studies, no one was surprised that Olaf Scholz wasn't welcomed in Brazil. And I said, oh, in my discipline, democracy studies and EU studies, everybody was surprised. And that, I think, underlines a clash. Yeah. So for a critical IR scholar who has this outlook of what is global studies, what is global governance, what is the world, when you come more from a world perspective, then you would say, obviously, Olaf Scholz is not welcome in Brazil. Brazil is like an up-and-coming state, and Europe and Germany with it is more sort of on its way down. I would doubt that every European politician has understood that. Yeah. And I would also doubt that we as EU scholars are really there. I think we are struggling with the fact that business as usual, like we used to work for the last 50, 60, 70 years, no longer works. So the question is, what does this mean for Europe? What does it mean for Europe that this, what is called France-Afrique, so the former French colonies in Africa, are really, really fed up with France. They don't want to follow France anymore, meaning they don't want to be collaborating closely with Europe anymore. What does it mean? Suddenly the terms of trade have been changing, and Europe is no longer in the world what it used to be, in numerous respects, in values, in geopolitical effects, aspects, in trade aspects. So the question is what this then means for Europe, and what is the new place for Europe in the world in all the respects mentioned. I would say that this approach to rethink the meanings of Europe, also the historical meanings of Europe, the ways Europe has been constructed, and possible alternative meanings of Europe, also gives us a potential for reconceptualizing Europe in the new world order. Yes, that's it. And I think I directly give over to Vivian for the moderation, and to, I think, Knud Erik for the next paper.
Yes.
And then we have a discussion at the end of the panels.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to come up front?
Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, welcome to the first panel that is titled, What is Europe? What is the world? And Claudia already delved into the topic and those questions. And yeah, for those who are participating online, just to let you know, the room is actually packed. So there are participants also here in person, but also welcome to those who are participating online. And yeah, now I want to welcome Knud Erik Joergensen, who is a professor in international relations at the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. And his research focuses on European foreign policy and international relations theory, and European External Action Service and EU diplomacy facing new realities. And now his presentation is on war and peace in European studies, a Zeitenwende. Please join me in welcoming Knud Erik Joergensen.
Nice to be back here in Fulda. I was here about 1 year ago. And yes, I can confirm that the title of my paper is War and Peace in European Studies, a Zeitenwende, or a paradigm shift. So my paper is not about the European Union. It is also not about Europe. It is about European studies as a field of research. And it is about what is happening in European studies as a field of research and teaching, and what is not happening. Just to clarify what the paper is all about. I wrote or prepared sort of the basic argument for a workshop here in Fulda last year. So basically, since then, the paper has been revised and a couple of times, and will now appear in the book that comes out on the basis of the workshop last year. Now, it is of course interesting then for me to revisit my old paper and see if the argument is still holding its strength. And it seems to me that what I argued 1 year ago and what I predicted really is still a valid argument. And that irritates me profoundly, because the aim of writing that paper and giving that talk 1 year ago was really to prompt a reconsideration of how things are in European studies. Then, of course, I can take some comfort in the fact that it's not published. So how can it then have an impact? But I think it has been circulated after all. And it is not up to my paper, of course, to make a change. It is up to the field of study, all the scholars who practice that field of study on a daily basis. So what is it that I really hoped that would happen in European studies? Well, I hope that there would be a Zeitenwende, a paradigm shift. And I hoped, on the background of the war at that time in Ukraine and since then elsewhere as well, that war as a phenomenon would be taken more serious in European studies. But I've been searching articles, conference themes, such things where scholars present their ideas, their perspectives. Didn't happen. War is still sort of outside what we scholars in European studies tend to find interesting and relevant. So this is really something I regret that I was right. And I think if at some point I would, if I decided to sort of make some theoretical underpinnings to my paper, it is in its present form, it is without theoretical underpinnings. But if I decided to equip it with some underpinnings of a theoretical nature, then I think I would choose sociological institutionalism, maybe a dash of historical institutionalism as well. And I'll tell you why. Because some of the key concepts in sociological institutionalism and historical institutionalism include concepts such as standard operating procedures. Procedures you don't think too much about because you just routinely reproduce them and make use of them time and again. You don't reflect each time that you consider a procedure or a way forward, a method. It is for that reason that they are standard operating procedures. They are taken for granted as applicable to a situation that you are in. Of course, sociological institutionalism also has a key concept such as appropriate behavior in a given or within a given community. And that seems to me to be highly relevant as well for a paper on this scholarly field. Then I would also include concepts such as the ceremonial and symbolic dimensions to our behavior and to our perspectives, because that is something that also those two theoretical perspectives emphasize strongly. And finally, if we talk about sociological institutionalism, it is something about protecting the identity of each person, how each person is consider himself or herself in the context of a given community. If we include some key concepts from historical institutionalism, then for sure it is concepts such as institutional inertia, that institutions tend to evolve slowly, gradually over time, and not in sort of jumping from one thing to another. And that is what a paradigm shift is all about, of course. Another key concept in historical institutionalism is path dependencies. And I mention these concepts because I think that they are highly relevant for us to understand developments in the field of European studies. There is a lot of path dependencies. There is a lot of ceremonial and symbolic action. There is a lot of standard operating procedures. There is a lot of path dependencies. And it has some negative consequences. And that is what I really would like to emphasize in the paper, and which I sort of do in some detail. Because if these concepts were in full operation, they would explain, first of all, the lack of innovation within European studies. They would also explain why more of the same dominates over, let's reconsider some things, some key conditions that prompt European studies to develop how it does, instead of more of the same tomorrow and the day after. And basically, they would explain the absence of a Zeitenwende, the absence of a paradigm shift within European studies. The prediction was it wouldn't happen. It now seems that it didn't happen. So in the paper, I did not include these theoretical underpinnings, but I did point to 4 different, and I believe good reasons, why there is no paradigm shift characterizing European studies. The first good reason is that if you consider or take into account wars as they have evolved over time, and here I'll ask you to sort of stretch your historical imagination and include all the 50, 60, 70 years when the process during which European integration has been in operation. So back to the 50s. Next time you consult some of the literature, look for how much reflection there is of the fact that France experienced a severe military defeat in Vietnam in 1954 and the subsequent launch of the European Community and the Rome Treaty. There is not that much that connect one to the other. But France had to seriously reconsider what France is, sort of the state identity of France, what it means to be France when you are kicked out of Vietnam. And a few years later, did not really perform well off the Suez Canal together with Great Britain, which turned out not to be so great. Military defeats in, from a European perspective, far away places, but clearly with some impact in Europe, at least in Western Europe at the time, because that was the only part of Europe where European integration took place. If you then move up the history, how much reflection in European studies is there that European integration 1960s and well into the 70s took place in parallel to the Vietnam War? Not that there is a direct impact of the Vietnam War on what is happening in Europe. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying that, or suggesting that there might be some impact after all, indirectly. Because at least Western Europe's strategic ally, the United States, was heavily involved in Vietnam. If we move up, big jump up to the 1990s, there were quite a few wars in what used to be Yugoslavia. In European studies, there's not much reflection about how the wars in Yugoslavia had an impact on the dynamics of European integration. We do know that the Maastricht Treaty came around, but the Maastricht Treaty was basically sort of an internal West European process launched due to German unification and France's insecurity towards this new big Germany, united. Not so much the wars, but after all, it was, you might have seen this citation of the Luxembourg Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, who's claimed that, okay, this is the time of Europe, we'll crisis management these wars in Yugoslavia. Didn't happen. But Europe got more and more embroiled in the wars, tried to do some diplomacy, but failed. Again, what is the interaction between the process in Europe of integration and wars? Very, very limited reflection. One of the most bloody wars during the 1980s took place a little bit longer, further away from Europe, namely between Iraq and Iran. But again, is it sort of, if a war is out of sight, is it then out of interest to, in this case, European diplomacy? There is not really any reflection of that issue in European studies. Maybe there is some specialty article published in some little known journal somewhere. I don't know. But in general, it is not on the top 20 of research themes. So for that reason, I concluded 1 year ago that most likely, even if the war unfolds in Ukraine as it does, the likely impact on European studies will most likely be pretty limited, because that has been the case before. And with standard operating procedures and path dependencies, why not sort of believe that that will happen again? And I don't see that the conflict between Hamas and Israel will change that at all. On the contrary. So that is one reason why a Zeitenwende in European studies is unlikely. But I have 3 more. And the second reason why it is the case is that if you look at European studies as a field of research and teaching, then it is an interdisciplinary field. You find economics, you find law, you find political science, you find international relations as disciplines. I'm not an economist. I'm also not a lawyer. So I should maybe be a little bit reluctant to be too sort of bold in my statement about those 2 disciplines. But I have this hunch that economists and lawyers don't really pay too much attention to war. Of course, there is a specialty discipline in law about laws of war, but that's a relatively limited subdiscipline in that field. And political scientists, do they care about war? Not really. They care about political parties, political opinions, attitudes, institutions, constitutions. But war? Sometimes they delegate it to international relations people. They take this topic, and then it's sort of in that small section of a political science typical department where international relations is being studied and people do research on it. At my department in Aarhus, I think we are a staff of 150 by now, and we are about 10 doing international relations. We are in a constant minority because all the other stuff is considered to be real political science stuff. And war, it is IR and to some degree in military academies for obvious reasons, but that's it. So path dependencies are very, very efficient in this respect. And we should not expect economists or lawyers to find war interesting tomorrow. And the same goes for political scientists. Of course, there's also this fact that as you proceed in your career, your publication list is piling up. More and more publications are coming out, of course, for good reasons. That's what we are paid for. But the more publications that are piling up on your list, the higher are the stakes for you, or the lower is the inclination that you do something new, because that takes time. And you are supposed to publish and publish and publish, but you don't teach. So you don't have time to think. So you tend to do more of the same. And we are supposed to be very innovative, you know that, but we don't have time to do it or to be. So that's a pity, but it's a fact. Third reason is that European studies in many, many different ways are built on a foundation that is quintessentially liberal. Liberal in a political view, liberal in a sort of international relations, liberal perspective sense. what I mean by that is that, first of all, I should be more precise here, because it is a distinct version of a liberal outlook that is sort of the foundation of European studies. And the distinctiveness of this liberal perspective is that it abandons the very idea that the use of force is any good. So everything has to be done by consent. And if something cannot be done by consent, then it shouldn't be done. And you can sort of shrug your shoulders and regret that something cannot happen because people cannot agree. Of course, I'm very much aware that opening the path towards the possible use of force is a dangerous road to walk down, because it can be abused, and it has time and again throughout history been abused a lot of times. But it seems to me that it would be wrong to let these abuses preclose the possibility from time to time to actually use force to achieve political objectives. But that is, in European studies, sort of almost a good reason to get fired from the field of study. And let's explain why a Zeitenwende, a paradigm shift that takes war into consideration, into serious consideration, is unlikely. There are simply too many people, my colleagues, my dear colleagues, who are not prepared to take that step. Then the fourth and final reason I've outlined in the paper is that European studies and war studies simply are incompatible. Because when some of my colleagues engage in war studies, they use, first of all, a vocabulary that is total unknown to European studies people. And it would take really a long teaching session for the two communities to begin to understand each other. And well, it's like this incompatibility of European studies and war studies. It's a bit like economics, that you know equals firms and markets minus externalities. In the context is the externalities that we can disregard, that we can decide not to think about, because we define our field of action as something that is similar to economists saying, okay, firms and markets, that's it. That's what we can do research on. That is what we can publish about. Externalities, somebody else have to take care of the externalities. European studies people would say, war, we cannot do that. We have a limited vocabulary. We have a limited supply, a portfolio of theoretical understandings or perspectives. So what we have is simply not capable of handling the phenomenon of war. And that means that I can conclude by saying that I regret to report that the paper I outlined last year remain valid. And I think we should discuss how European studies could become innovative, could start taking war serious, could begin to provide some sound policy prescriptions. And just to give you an idea about which direction I think we should be moving, let me sort of as a suspense thing give you the first sentence of my contribution to the roundtable tonight, where I will start by saying that I think that the European Union should begin to prepare for war. Thank you.
Thank you, Knud, Erik, Joergensen, for your very interesting talk and the perspectives on European studies in relation to war or war studies, and raising the question of a lacking or potentially lacking paradigm shift within the field. And yeah, I would now hand over to Oriol Costa, who is an associate professor of international relations at the University in Barcelona, and his research and teaching focus is on IR theory, international relations, and the contemporary international system, which he will also talk in his presentation today. He will focus on EU foreign policy in a fragmenting international order. So, Oriol, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm gonna share some slides if that's okay with you.
Of course.
Let me see if I'm able to do that correctly. Where is that? Let me try again. Can you see my slides? No, you can't.
Unfortunately, no.
Okay, wait a second. That might be because I need to. Okay, anyway, I can also you guys do it in a different way. Now that should be better. Now that should be better. I had forgotten how to do this after after a couple of years of not teaching online. Okay, so this is my presentation. Now you can see it.
Now we can see your screen.
Yes. I should also be able to do this so that you can. Wait a second, so that you can see it correctly. Now, so I'm really sorry for not being able to be there in person. I really enjoy the company of colleagues and the kind of talks and exchanges that take place during meals and in coffee breaks and so on. So I'm really sorry for not being able to be there. I have to say that as compared to the initial program, there was a change in the title and orientation of my talk. I had read Knud Erik's paper in the book, and I liked it so much, and mine was so much of a lesser version of what he had said, but applied to IR instead of European studies, that I felt that I needed to do something completely different, not to be like the little brother of his really insightful and interesting reflection on the state of European studies on the issue of the wars, and doing something that is completely different. I'm basically presenting a book project that I'm co-editing with two other colleagues at IBE, the Institute of Barcelona Institute of International Studies, within the framework of a common research project that we share on a topic that I think that speaks directly to the main theme of both this panel and the workshop more broadly, which is this idea of EU foreign policy in a world that is changing very quickly and is getting much more conflictive and much more complicated for the EU to navigate. And from this point of view, we are full disclosure, IR people coming into the EU, if you wish, from the inside out, or from the outside in, and trying to understand how the EU it is as it is, because it is part of a world, or takes part in a world that also shapes the EU and shapes the role the EU takes in this international order. So we take as the baseline for our claim that the order is fragmenting. We take as a baseline that of course can be contested, can be problematized, which is the kind of international order that existed during the 90s and early 2000s, or perhaps the first full decade of the 21st century. This liberal international order, which is basically a set of institutions and norms and rules that build upon let's say the expected or aspiration, at least, universalization of institutions and norms that basically applied to the West during the Cold War, and also builds on perhaps a bit more progressive norms that had to do with human rights, that had to do with all sorts of cosmopolitan aspirations about what international society had to look like. This version of international order, we say, is fragmenting and on many occasions eroding or regressing, right? And we took fragmentation to mean a number of a bundle, if you wish, of processes that have to do with different aspects. They have to do with challenges and to the universality of human rights, right? Out of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council now, 3 of them, and this includes the US and the Trump, have made claims that deny the universality of human rights, right? The idea of traditional human rights and traditional values as mediating between human rights and state practice. That's a claim by Russia, for instance, right? Or the list of inalienable rights that the Trump administration produced, in a way, trying to create a number of different categories within the family of human rights, or the role of sovereignty in the claims that China makes about this, right? So so from challenges to human rights to crises in global governance instruments, to the bifurcation of tech, or to protectionist tendencies in trade policies, or the meeting of trade policies and security concerns. All of these basically piles up on this idea of fragmentation as basically having to do with moving from a global order to an architecture that, of course, it has also ordering effects, but is characterized by a much greater degree of diversity and plurality, right? It has many different facets and degrees, if you wish. I will come back to this later on. It goes from functional differentiation, which in a way is an outgrowth of the development and enrichment, if you wish, of the liberal international order of the 1990s and early 2000s. It has to do with regionalization, which was already part of what the UN system back in 1945 already was able to accommodate, right? Perhaps stronger versions of regionalization, more conflicted versions of regionalization. It has to do with the competition between different governance schemes at the international level. It has to do with international norms that are very strongly localized, to the point of making them much less related to their global family members of norms, so to speak. It has to do with our right contestation of international order. Of course, it has to do with great power rivalry. So it has many different facets. I will come back to this diversity of elements that we can put together under the label of fragmentation, and of course they reinforce each other's. They change the meanings they have. Regionalization means different things when you have great power rivalry. And when you don't have it, competition between governance schemes can also be orchestrated by great powers who are in a conflicted relationship with each other. So all this, in a way, interacts and makes the meaning of each of these different facets different from what it'd be without their other companion facets, so to speak, right? So, but it's a complicated process that is taking place nevertheless. We think that this is really critical for EU foreign policy. That this basically, in a way, puts our old assumptions on EU foreign policy, both analytical assumptions and assumptions of policy making, of the world of policy making. It puts many of these old assumptions at risk, or if not to sleep for good. The idea that EU foreign policy, or that the international role of the EU, is basically the externalization of internal consensuses, right? That's I think worthy of reconsideration. It was always worthy of reconsideration, but now even more so, because on many of these issues, it's very complicated for the EU to come up with an internal consensus at all, right? Because of course the issues have changed, the challenges the EU should be addressing have changed as well. The EU used to take multilateral institutions as a constitutive part of its own definition of what the EU should be doing. Once those multilateral institutions are not able to make norms anymore, then the reference point of just taking the multilateral norm on board and making your own, that doesn't exist anymore on many issue areas. The assumption that interdependence is basically good, right? That was very much a fixture of European foreign policy, both at the EU level and for many member states, right? If you wish, the idea of van der handle, of course, has to do with these, right? This idea of interdependence as a way to provide security with soft tools. That's perhaps one of the reasons why we haven't, or European studies have not thought about war, as Erik was raising before, might be because we thought that there was like this win-win way not to do wars and address security threats, which was just to trade, right, or to exchange students or whatnot. Right? Interdependence as driving also positive change more broadly, not only on security terms. That's also at stake. It has been so for the last few years. The idea of weaponized interdependence, of course, is very much at the forefront of this. The liberal international order itself was very much instrumental in EU foreign policy strategic thinking, right? Even the strategic thinking that was implicit or not, made explicit in or not necessarily, not completely explicit in strategic documents. The idea was that the liberal international order was our best bet, so to speak, and that the EU foreign policy had to do with reforming it and expanding it, right? Making it stronger, adding post-national elements to it, making it, bring the creation of the ICC, for instance, right? So you are creating a new institution and you are adding a more institutional muscle into the order. And of course, you are tying Gulliver down with a few more ropes, and Gulliver here being the Leviathan, if you wish, or the US, if you want to be a bit more, narrow in your understanding of what this means. And then you added expectations about how the states should treat individuals and what happened to individuals that were not treating, on behalf of their states, not treating individuals as they should, right? Of course, this requires a functioning and effective liberal international order, right? It was pro-status quo and reformist at the same time. It had a program of change, and at the same time, it was a program that could begin from this world, right? It didn't need to completely overhaul the order. It could take these as the baseline to move it forward. And then finally, the idea that because of that, the trajectory of international order was basically in line with EU preferences and ideas, right? That at some level of abstraction, at least, the EU was seen as the vanguard in this direction of travel, so to speak, right? That the EU was the most advanced, most accomplished way to think about international relations in this post-national, strongly legalized, rules-based, blah blah way, right? All assumptions on EU foreign policy, I think, are over, or at least are in a deep crisis, the end of which we cannot foresee with any degree of certainty, right? To put it mildly. And our book tries to look at the different ways in which different actors of EU member states or EU institutions, EU groups, so groups at the European Parliament or civil society organizations are reacting to this fragmentation of the liberal international order and trying to make sense of what it means for EU foreign policy or the international role of the EU going forward, right? We need to address, of course, the elephant in the room here, which is that in EU speak, the ways in which this is talked about is in terms of this strategic autonomy language, right? The EU is supposed to become more strategic because of there seems to be many more zero-sum situations than there used to be or that we perceive them to be. And this forces you to think of your own behavior in relationship with the behavior of others, and potentially in conflict with the behavior of others, thinking that what you want to accomplish and your capacity to do so and the mechanisms by which you might do so will be most of the time negatively affected by what others want to accomplish and the way they behave because of that, right? And then autonomy, because interdependence is seen as a vulnerability, right? And hence the EU thinks of itself as needing to be more autonomous, just to escape this idea of, the more the merrier, the more interlinked, the better, right? And of course, if interdependence is a vulnerability, then of course you need to look at states you are more interdependent with and start seeing those links as a liability, right? And of course, the more we get closer to November 2024, the more the US will become a clear part of this, at least as much as it was so up until 2020. And for security reasons, of course, and as the US is the basic provider of security for European member states, EU member states, and then, of course, from an economic point of view, that is very much China. It's very much about China, right? But the same has been true at least until February 2022 with Russian and energy, and there are other, second level, if you wish, actors from that point of view. The interdependency with which the EU might be thinking about reducing, right? But nevertheless, this concept of strategic autonomy bothers us a little bit, right? We need to address it because that's, I guess, very much the expectation so the expectation is that when you deal with the EU and in a fragmenting international order, you will talk about this, and this is true at the policy level, but also, I think, among scholars, among colleagues, of course. So it bothers us a little bit, right? It has a very clear meaning. We take it as a bundle of speech acts, not one single concept, but basically a field of concepts, if you wish, that you could unpack a little bit, and that are, since they are speech acts, are ways to intervene in political debates more than ways to grasp what is being said. It's more a term of policy making and politics making than a term for an analyst, perhaps. And of course, it's not the only way actors can react to structural pressures, right? I like this quotation from Blyth very much. It's a bit old, it's 20 years old, but it's still true, right? That structures do not come with an instruction sheet. There are many worldviews that will mediate from structural pressures, to the way actors react to those structural pressures. So so our idea here is to try and, of course, unpack the different meanings strategic economy can have, and locate those meanings in a much broader, analytically driven space of possible reactions, possible EU reactions to the fragmentation of the liberal international order. And that's exactly what the book is trying to do. I'm not going to go into details here. I've used this table in other places as well. This is, I guess, the last time I'm using it for this book, right? But we try to identify two different logics and three different, if you wish, geopolitical worldviews, right? Two different logics that have to do with either you accept that the liberal international order is fragmenting and that you need to play by those rules, the rules of fragmentation, right? And there are both normative and interest-based reasons to do that, or you reject that logic. You say, okay, that might be where the world is going, but I'm not playing by those rules, right? That's over, that's beneath me, perhaps, or that's something I cannot do because there are normative constraints on the things I'm ready to do, or there might also be interest-based reasons to do that, right? I do not accept this because I'm an exporter superpower, economic superpower, and hence I want to still believe that the handle is possible, and so I have a vested interest in keeping the idea that perhaps by insisting on not playing by rejecting the logic of fragmentation, by insisting in not playing by the rules of fragmentation and sticking to this globalized idea of order, are still, we can still get what we had back, right? So something along those lines. So you can either accept the new rules, or reject that there are new rules, or that you can play by the new rules, right? And then you can look at the world by way of three different, if you will, geopolitical mindsets. You can think of the nation as the basic actor there, or as the nation mediated by two different layers, right? One would be the Western alliance. So you would think of your own state as basically not a nation state, but a member state, if you wish, of the Western alliance, or as a member state of the EU, as a member state of Europe, if you wish. And these are two different things, right? But there's quite a bit of an overlap there. And then we explore what this would mean in these different cells. Of course, if you are an Atlanticist, this is one. There are two different possibilities here. Like the U.S. administration is also an Atlanticist, or the U.S. administration is not an Atlanticist, right? Which has become a more likely option in the last few years, the last decade, so to speak. And of course, this opens different options here, right? So I'm not going to go into detail here, but that's the sort of options that we want to explore. In which actors tend to sit in each of these cells, or perhaps which issues tend to bias where actors are based in these cells, depending on issue-specific differences, right? We are now just receiving chapters. The second versions of chapters, so to speak. So I thought I could bring here the outcomes, the outputs, or the findings, but I'm still not able to do that. We have been receiving chapters for the last couple of days, so I have read 4 of them. I have some thoughts that I will share later on with you, but that's what we want to do. Right? Okay, these are the chapters we have. So it's a broad-based selection of topics that we deal with, just in case you find any of those interesting. This is just basically me flagging that there might be chapters or authors that you might be interested in getting in contact with, or whatever, right? So we go from classically technical or so-called technical issues to more openly political and security issues, right? Good. So some preliminary thoughts on this. Again, this is not a systematic overview on findings, but it's basically me picking some thoughts from these 4 chapters I've been able to read in the last 2 days and work with and to bring that to this meeting of ours, right? The first one is that there is parts of fragmentation. So some of the elements of fragmentation are as old as the international law that we know about, right? So as old as 1989, or if you wish, as old as 1945, right? There is a big overlap between, or some overlap between fragmentation and regionalization, right? And some of these issue areas are strongly regionalized, right? There's, like human rights is strongly regionalized. Regional organizations are really important for human rights. Health is also strongly regionalized, right? The WHO has had strong regional offices for a very long time. There's also vertical specialization on some of these issue areas. Like, again, health is very much an issue here, right? Actually, when it comes to health, the more liberal the international order has been, the more fragmented it has become, right? Because you have had this additional vertical, let's focus on that problem, like that health problem. Let's focus on that kind of whatever, right? So like malaria, for instance, or AIDS, or whatnot, right? And then there has been within this both regional and vertical specializations in the world of health, the participation of different actors, sometimes private, sometimes state actors. So there's quite a lot of fragmentation here already taking place, precisely because of the regime complex becoming more liberal than it used to be. So there is quite a lot of leeway within the UN system to accommodate for some kinds of fragmentation. But of course, this is not all that it is happening, right? There are other stuff. There's other stuff happening that does not sit so nicely or so easily and comfortably within like the leeway the UN system provides, right? There's quite a lot of path dependence here in the ways fragmentation takes place. Fragmentation tends to open cracks that already existed before, right? And so cracks that were not even perceived as negative or as detrimental to the regime or regime complex at hand, right? And again, like human rights and health seem super obvious here, but there are other examples as well, right? So institutional path dependencies, if you wish, a historical institutionalist approach also is very fruitful here to account for the ways in which fragmentation takes place. And of course, many of these issues became policy issues precisely when fragmentation, the broader fragmentation, like a more conflictive international order, had already started to manifest themselves, right? Artificial intelligence and raw materials are 2 cases in point here. Of course, here this means that it's fragmented, but it's not in fragmentation, so to speak, right? It contributes to the fragmentation of the international order, but they are not fragmenting themselves as issues because they already were born as policy issues being fragmented. One thing that is striking me from this chapter that I'm working with is that there seems to be some sort of catch-22, and I promise this is my last slide. There seems to be some sort of catch-22 thing here. So the EU responds, for the EU to respond to these changes, it needs to take decisions, right? If it doesn't take decisions, then it's business as usual. And decisions are easier to take the stronger the EU is, the more competencies have been pulled into the EU. And precisely because like the EU is it has to do with the liberal order itself. It's the EU is a manifestation of this order, And integration is that, it's integration, it's economic integration in the first place, right? So on many of these issues, the issues in which it would be easier for the EU to react to fragmentation, there are also issues in which you have strong bureaucracies in the European Commission. And these strong bureaucracies more often than not have strong liberal, pro-liberal international order ethos, right? Like trade, and here you have DG trade pushing against strategic autonomy and saying, perhaps it's open strategic autonomy, right? Trying to look for like moving to the risking language, and of course the risking doesn't mean less interdependence; it means interdependence with a broader array of countries. So there's all these ways in which, or for instance, when it comes to the global gateway, the DG development is trying, the development people is trying to like keep these under like the normative take of development, right? Not competition with the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So these strong bureaucracies might have more of a capacity to change, but less of a willingness to change, because they are imbued in this organizational culture, if you wish, that still pushes for, if you wish, the rejection of the new rules of the game. That might be a way to look at that. And on the other hand, when you know these when there's perhaps more momentum behind a more strategic way to look into these issues, then these more geopolitical responses tend to fade away, right? So policy makers from states, for instance, or from more intergovernmental settings lose interest in the global gateway because, you know, it has become out of fashion or it's perceived as not interesting anymore. And then this means that the global gateway will be more under control by development types in the Commission, and hence less amenable to this sort of geopolitical take on what it should mean, right? So my hunch here is that if anybody is interested in the EU turning more strategic and more autonomous, so to speak, then it needs to build institutions. There's institution building that would matter for, you know, if they used to take this new route more forcefully and at sort of the rhythm or the speed that the world seems to be requiring. And then finally, a paradox, which is that sometimes the logic of rejecting the logic of a fragmenting liberal international order is presented as an act of realism, right? So there are policymakers or people from the policy community, including think tankers and so on, or people who comment on policies from a policy relevant point of view, so to speak, that just do not see this as an option, as a realistic option, that do not see playing by the, like making the EU speak the language of power, as Oriol would say, right? Do not see this as a realistic possibility, and then they choose not to pose problems that the EU might not be able to solve, right? And I think that non-proliferation of nuclear power seems to be among these issues, right? There seems to be like the understanding that this is above and beyond what the EU can do. Of course, we can help, like orchestrate, you know, like help, you know, fund and hence orchestrate multilateral institutions when that can. But most of the high politics on this Iran deal aside is above and beyond what Europe or the EU can do. So let's not even try, right? So there seems to be on some occasions the idea that this is for somebody else to do. The EU is fine not even addressing these problems. Perhaps this speaks to Knud Erik's points before. And these are just options that we should not consider, right? So perhaps the seemingly idealistic take of let's not accept the fact that the liberal international order is fragmenting, it might not be so idealistic. It might be an act of realism about what the EU can accomplish and hence what kind of tasks it can address. Thank you very much. I hope I did not speak for too long.
Yeah, thank you, Oriol, for that interesting presentation and sharing your preliminary thoughts on findings. I would like to ask Claudia and Knud also to the front to start the Q&A session or the discussion, or do you prefer sitting there? Yeah, I think so too. So yeah, I would then open the floor for questions or comments. And I think we have roughly about 30 minutes for questions.
Nobody else wants to start? I'll start. So thank you very much. I think those were really interesting kickoff presentations. I must say I was quite baffled by Knud Erik's presentation and your characterization of your discipline and also of your characterization of adjacent disciplines, including my own. So maybe you can just help me clear up the confusion. I think Europe is a continent that is one of the most belligerent continents in the history of mankind. The 30 Years' War gave rise to the modern nation state. The European community was founded after the experience of 2 world wars. So how is it possible, first question, that the discipline of European studies is so blissfully unaware of the importance of war to state formation, to identity formation, to regional integration? That is something that quite surprised me. And I also think that you posed the question how European studies can be more innovative and progressive. And I think my suggestion would be to maybe take off the blinders and look at what adjacent disciplines are doing, because you said that political scientists, international lawyers don't really care about war. I strongly disagree. I think the question of why states go to war and how wars can be hedged and overcome are among the perennial questions in political science and in peace and conflict studies, Friedens- und Konfliktforschung. In the discipline of international law, there are those who study how the act of going to war can be regulated, the jus ad bellum, and that's a big branch of international law. And then there's also the other sub-discipline that looks into the laws of war. How can wars be hedged? How can the conduct of the warring parties can be made less harmful to civilians, etc. So I think I suggest if European studies wants to remain relevant and innovative, they should take into account all of the research that has been going on in these adjacent disciplines and sub-disciplines. But maybe I misunderstood the presentation or the argument. Maybe, you know, I was just very confused listening to how you characterized everything that has been done in those disciplines.
Do we collect or?
I think you can.
And by the way, it's really cold in this room. Is it just me or? Okay, it's not just me. Yeah.
Okay, yes. I guess that is one of the sort of unintended consequences of being too bold in making an argument. That I presented this as black and white. There is no place in my talk for the gray zones. But this said, I think there is still something to European studies that takes something from sort of the basic disciplines and mix it into a field of research. I don't think it's a discipline as such. It's not disciplined enough to be a discipline, like law, like political science, like economics. So it's a little bit of sort of a buffet where you pick and choose what you think you can use, and then you sort of do your stuff. And in that process of picking from the buffet what you like, war is left out of consideration. And that is a big mystery, because you're absolutely right. Europe is historically very well aware of painfully the phenomenon of war. And yes, 2 world wars caused, among other things, the process of European integration. Of course, I guess what happened was that war as an actual phenomenon was taken and it was kind of morphed into the mythology of the reason or the rationale for European integration. So it became part of the mythology and not of a still existing phenomenon in international or world politics. And everything that happened in world politics concerned that was sort of about that was warfare was kind of left outside. And if you look at sort of the development of theoretical of theorizing within European studies, neo-functionalism came around as one of the first attempts. And as a first attempt, okay, it has its strong sides, but also its weaknesses. And basically, neo-functionalism is to look at all sorts of domestic factors within Europe and say, okay, now they are providing a dynamics towards integration. Political parties, trade unions, they can see it as their, in their rational thinking that integration is good for us. So for that reason, eventually, they will come around and support the enterprise. It was also one of the first things that neo-functionalism was criticized for. Stanley Hoffman's critique of Ernest Haas was exactly that he sort of abstracted away the rest of the world. And if you look at then subsequent attempts at theorizing, it has been a continuation, at least external factors where wars actually happen, was neglected, not taken on board as something that was relevant for what was happening in Europe. And of course, it is an even bigger mystery that could happen, because you mentioned the 30 Years' War and all the historical wars and the 2 world wars. You didn't mention all the colonial wars that happened simultaneously with the first phases of European integration. So it's really sort of a, if you want to give an example of someone who can concentrate on something by not thinking about anything else, this is a fantastic example of scholars being able to concentrate on something that is happening in Europe and at the same time disregarding the rest. And even now I mentioned the colonial wars, you mentioned at your introduction the Fulda Gap and the Cold War. The first, how many decades? 3 decades of the first 3 decades of European integration happened in the context of the Cold War. And still, 1970s, people began to talk about civilian power Europe. Hey, this is civilian power Europe in a world characterized by Cold War, 100%. It's amazing that these compartmentalizations mentally can happen.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to comment and add my question to Knud, Erik, and Oriol. First of all, what is your discipline? What would you say is your discipline? Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
So I think it's just a phenomenon that
Yes, scientists, regardless of their studies.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So I think we all agree that we ought to take this into account. Let me sort of respond to your question and add my comment. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I think actually our presentations added up surprisingly well to a picture. Well, can I say I like it or can I say I dislike it? What I like about the European Union, obviously, is that this is why Ian Manners has termed it a normative power, because they have abandoned war as a concept. 2 days ago, we had a young lady in the room and she asked whether Russia couldn't have been integrated better into the European Union and whether Russia couldn't have been receiving more incentives to be linked to the European Union. And I was thinking by myself, well, it got a lot of incentives, namely those incentives that the EU usually gives, change through trade. Especially in Germany, many people believe that change through trade would work. And that's very much the imperative and the impetus that is behind the EU's actions in the world. So they sort of believed that this economic prosperity narrative linked to the liberal international order would just be working and would just be attractive for the rest of the world. And we see that this doesn't work anymore, but sort of what I don't actually know what to do out of your 2 presentations now, even if it doesn't surprise me, but it also frightens me. So I think you were saying that the fact that war is not taken into consideration not only is a kind of analytical flaw, it's also something that sort of doesn't allow us to see the world as it is and to conceptualize a world in which war is happening. So that's a kind of real political danger. I think Oriol was saying about the same, about the EU bureaucracy. And it is strangely in fit with what I was saying about the EU bureaucracy. So we have a path dependency, we stick to it, we go for it, and this path dependency is linked to the liberal international order. And this is what we try to reproduce, except that if you try to reproduce the liberal international order at times when it doesn't work anymore, you will necessarily end up in trouble. And I say I have this kind of split opinion because I really always liked that part about the normative power Europe and about the non-war waging region. That's obviously very appealing, like in normative ways. And I think it really crashed, like smashed full scale into the wall with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because suddenly both EU politicians and EU scholars alike were like, oh my God, what do we do now? See, it doesn't work. So change through trade doesn't work. So what do we do now? Now we are threatened. And I think you are right about unfortunately, about the EU needs to prepare for war. And I think that the reactions that we see in the EU, both in EU studies and in EU sort of politics, document that it's not, and that it's very difficult to think that. So lots to discuss tonight and in the coming days.
Hey, hello everybody, Niklas Bremberg, Stockholm University. This has been a real treat and I really enjoyed all the presentations, and I think we had a very good start for our workshop. So I think I have questions for all presenters. So I'd start with Claudia and Claudia's presentation. I think, I mean, you're very right in pointing out the kind of the essential contestedness of the idea of Europe, but I was somehow lacking maybe more of a reflection on kind of the actual kind of, there's one way of saying that obviously we as an engaged in academic exercise cannot necessarily pin down what the meaning of Europe is, but obviously we can do research on how the meanings of Europe has been used over time. And so I would like to kind of hear more from you about what you think has been the kind of the predominant use of Europe, and particularly linked to visions of European integration that we're seeing today by actors that are pushing for a very different kind of Europe and European cooperation. I'm thinking particularly by the works of, for instance, a colleague like Hans Knud that has, in his recent book Euro Whiteness, showed that what basically the liberal pro-Europeans have somehow missed is that there's always been a race identity at the core of the meaning of Europe, obviously. So even though we would like that Europe would be universal, it's not really and has not never ever been that. So in that sense, I think they're maybe we cannot only stop our analysis of the contested nature of the meanings of Europe by saying that it is, there is different meanings at play here, but maybe we also need to go a little bit further and look at in what way that particular notion of Europe has always been there, and it is now being energized again, and there's resonance in a version of Europe that is much more focused on the nations again, and particular versions of who belongs in Europe in particular. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, because obviously that can also be a way of integrating Europe, right? But very much less on a rules-based, right-based order, and that seems to be on the rise. So for Knud, Erik, I think you're right in many of your observations, but I would be very curious to hear your ideas and reflections on how we should get out of a situation where you say that basically all the variables, so to speak, that you have put on the table points in just one direction, basically towards perpetuating the status quo in European studies. It's extremely hard for us to envision how individual scholars would break with status quo, since, as you say, everyone has to publish. It's the incentives are not necessarily there, etc., etc., etc. So since you have been engaged in so long with academic networking and thinking about how to do maybe European studies differently, what would be your best suggestion for us to think about doing European studies differently moving forward? And to Oriol, quick question. Really like that book project. Very much looking forward to see that coming to completion. Of course, also very much regretting that you're not here with us, but that's how it is. We'll have to find a different place and time for us to meet in person. But I was thinking a little bit about your categorization that you ended up with, the nationalist, how different dispositions would react to the logics of rejecting or accepting a more fragmented liberal order or world order. There seems to be difficulties to disentangle the Atlanticist and the Europeanist, in the sense that seems to be very much dependent on who is in the White House and what has happened and the role of US in the US in Europe since 1945. So in a sense, I'm not sure how to for instance, categorize a country like Sweden, obviously not been part of NATO after the war, but you could say heavily Atlanticist in its outlook and not necessarily pro-European or convinced Europeanist. So how would you categorize a country like that in your scheme, for instance? Thank you very much.
Since we don't have that much time left, I would suggest to collect questions. So person right next to you.
Thank you. My name is Joergensen. I'm a PhD candidate at Uppsala University in Sweden. So I have a question for all three as well. And I think they might work quite well with Niklas' questions as well. So first to Claudia then. I was wondering if, and this is an open question, should we have different expectations on the possibility to attach meanings to the EU and Europe? My thought process here is that the EU very much is what the EU does, in a sense, while the same cannot be said for Europe. The Europe doesn't really do anything in the same sense that the EU does something. In the same sense, the EU may act contradictory to its values or may not live up to its values. The same really might not be able to be said about Europe. And then a question which I think relates to what Niklas was talking about, and this, isn't the question of what Europe is sort of an empirical question, really? I mean, how it is used. I mean, put a bit harshly, I mean, what is the value sort of constructing or defining a definition of Europe that is not rooted sort of in the understandings of Europe, of people inside and outside Europe? So, Knud, Erik, a question to you. I was wondering sort of the implications of not taking war seriously in EU studies. In what way would we do research differently? I mean, when we do research, we don't simply look at a topic, we look at research questions. So what are the research questions that we are not asking and not answering? What do you want us to look at? That was what I was wondering. And for Oriol, I had a comment also about the table, like Niklas. I was thinking about the Atlanticists. And I mean, isn't it possible and quite likely that the sort of the US Atlanticists who sort of accept the new rules, as you call it, of the fragmented world order, may also be against efforts for the EU to also strengthen their strategic autonomy? I'm not sure if I maybe misunderstood the table, but I got the feeling that they were sort of pro strategic autonomy. But I mean, you could just as well argue that, yeah, I mean that they might be against the strengthening of EU strategic autonomy simply because that is a threat to their economic interests. The EU would no longer sort of procure US equipment to the same extent, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so 3 questions. Thanks.
Shall we do a first round of answers and then we'll go to the last questions? Yeah, who wants to start?
Okay. Okay, so my questions mainly concern the meanings of Europe. I'll start with Niklas's remark, and I totally agree. Of course, I totally agree. We can do research, we should be doing research on how the meaning of Euro has been used about time. I totally agree. I agree to the point that I would really strengthen that argument. And I think I said something on this in my presentation. So it has been used in strategic ways. It has been used on purpose. It has been associated with good things, bad things. It has been used as an ideological tool, to the point that I really would say there are good arguments to say that Europe is almost an empty signifier, because it has been so much used and constructed and contested that it's really, really difficult to develop at least something like a unified essentialist meaning of what Europe is. So I would really firmly stick to that. I mean, then I would agree that probably we could discern something like in most cases or in many cases, these and that ideas have been associated with, but I really find it difficult. So I think I would say the question is what the idea of Europe has been linked to and by whom and why, and what we can sort of learn from that and what we can conclude from that. And one conclusion is obviously that I would be really critical of a notion such as Eurocentrism. Because if there is not one Europe, then what is Eurocentrism? Eurocentrism, I would say, doesn't mean the same when you go to Sweden, when you go to Bulgaria, and when you go to Greece. It's a different Europe that is at stake. And in this book, The Meanings of Europe, we even went back into history. And one chapter in the book concerns the Marrano Jews in Spain. So that's also a historical part of Europe. And when you really go looking for something like a Eurocentrist essence in that, you will be at a loss. So I would never deny that whiteness, colonialism, all that, the distinction against the barbarian and against the Orient for a long time obviously has been something like an important motive in conceptualizations of Europe, but there have always been the other motives. And this is why I would say, I think we could learn from being more sensitive, both in analytical terms and in debating terms, of conceptualizing Europe as one and the other, which I think links nicely to what August said. Yes, I think, again, I agree. It's much more easy to attach meanings to the EU because the meanings of the EU are very much linked to what the EU does. Now, unfortunately, I have the pleasure, or sometimes not the pleasure, to teach EU studies to many people present in this room. It's not sometimes easy to sell Europe. Yeah, you get a conclusion from the European Council on them willing to build up detention camps for migrants at the borders. Have fun to explain this to your students in human rights or in EU studies the next days. I mean, that's not something that is a positive image of the European Union. Still, the European Union is and does something concrete. So it has some concrete meanings that are associated with it. I would, again, agree it's not the same that might be true for Europe. However, I would say that the European Union tries to adopt those positive aspects of, or the aspects that they think out of this broad bucket of traditions, of conceptual traditions, in discussing about the concept of Europe, in order to give the European Union and what it does a positive connotation. I think that's it. So I think it's really a kind of probably not so much researched area on how those conceptualizations, the historical conceptualizations, how they are sold, like in very concrete terms, in hard politics and in questions of war and peace.
Just short, yeah. Okay, three comments. First about the meanings of Europe. I have a lot of sympathy for that project, because and I think I understand why it is that it is up again to kind of understand the meanings of Europe, because people have become uncertain about what it implies to be Europe, or to be a European, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I believe, or it seems to me, that it is a kind of mission impossible, because there are all these historical layers, and there are all these different perspectives of what Europe is. So yes, you can do a lot of excavations, and you can do a lot of mapping about these different meanings and how they evolve over time. And that is very, very helpful and useful knowledge to have. But it is a mission impossible, just as it is impossible to discover sort of the basic meanings of America, or Africa, or Asia. It is simply too, the diversity is too pronounced at a continent level, I believe. But nonetheless, even if it is a mission impossible, it is a mission that should be engaged in. About what ought to be done in order to proceed from this kind of nihilistic perspective that I presented in my talk. Well, I think one starting point could be to acknowledge or realize, accept that the days of normative power Europe is over. It doesn't exist any longer, that situation. It was a situation in the early decade of this century. Then, in the context of the financial crisis and all the ramifications of that crisis, Europe went into a decline in international context. And Europe cannot do what Europe used to be able to do. So normative power Europe, gone. Civilian power Europe was something that was conceptualized in the 70s when people began to talk about interdependence. Henry Kissinger, among other people. But that is also a situation or a configuration of international life that is gone. And already at that time, it was a little bit of an abstraction from the Cold War, because the world was not interdependent in the 1970s. The world was very polarized in East and West. Then, of course, we can proceed and take the 25 or more other power Europe conceptions and reconsider them and ask, are they still valid? Do they have any context? Do they have any sort of relationship, direct relationship? Do they have a relevance? And if they are not having a relevance, then what can we do? Well, for example, we could maybe begin to conceptualize power in those conceptualizations more than has been done so far. Because most of the time, the Power Europe literature has been very proliferating in adjectives: civilian, normative, military, idiot Power Europe. There's no end to what Europe power is. But very few of all these studies have really digged into what is power. How much power does Europe have? Which kind of power? What is the power used for? What could it be used for? What ought it to be used for? So that is maybe one way to start, to actually show a serious interest in what it means to have power and try to measure how much there is and in which direction it is being employed. Finally, about the research question. I had so much hope that Oriol would take that one, because that was what the title suggested. Because that was about the sort of early days of the discipline of international relations. And at that time, there was a wonderful research question. What are the causes of war and what are the conditions for peace? It's an evergreen research question, but it has been forgotten, except in some corners, where in international, well, not somewhat, yeah, international law, but then international law, of course, is not the law discipline. I guess most lawyers don't do international law. They do private law. And if they do international law, then it is international private law. No? Yeah. yeah, sure. So I think that is at least one proposal for a research question that we could focus a little bit more on.
So I'm handing over to Oriol and then to our last question.
Yes, very brief. I might even have to leave at 10:04 max. Just an issue I wanted to raise, and then I will address Niklas and the question from the participant from Uppsala. I didn't get the name right. I just wanted to say that I think that part of what we are now talking about, or at least what I wanted to address, and partially what Claudia addressed in her comment now, had to do with how the EU is this sort of very much rules-based also, right? And rules-based integration means also very little space for political discretion, right? And there are, and I think that this is normatively a bit more complicated and a bit more nuanced than we normally take it to be, right? Let me raise a couple of examples that do not come from EU foreign policy or international relations at all. I mean, one of them does, but partially only. Mario Draghi raised this issue in a speech a few years ago, saying when it comes to macroeconomic management and the EU and monetary policy and fiscal policy, we are too much boiled into our rules, and there's very little political discretion, and it's very hard to address economic problems when you don't have the kind of discretion that you need to take decisions and reverse courses of events, right? Of course, he was in a way vindicating his role as the whatever it takes role and so on. He was also trying to criticize rules that have to do with spending, rules that have to do with capacity to run deficits and debts and so on. I think that since I'm not there, but I still share, I guess, into the Germanness of the meeting, or everything that is happening right now in Germany as regards the capacity of the government to put together a budget, and whether Karlsruhe should be able to have a say in that, or what are the downsides of that taking place, is about also this extreme Kelsen, if you wish, world in which we live, in which political discretion is very limited, right? Or if you think about the last speech on the State of the Union and what Ursula von der Leyen said on cars and China and e-cars, actually, right? Electric cars and China, and how the Commission is getting ready to crack down on what it perceives to be subsidized imports of electric cars from China. Of course, that has to do with the rules of the WTO and with our own rules, and we apply to others what we apply to ourselves, and so on and so forth. It makes a lot of sense. At the same time, it makes fighting against climate change much more complicated. We might be complying with WTO rules on imports and subsidies and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it also, of course, makes the electrification of transport in Europe is more complicated, right? So it's a bit more, I think that this trade-off between political discretion and rules, it's normatively very nuanced, and there are plenty of trade-offs there to consider. Then on Nicholas' comment, I would also like to be there, Nicholas, so we'll find an occasion. We are not trying to locate countries in these tables. We are trying to locate countries or other actors per issue, right? So the same country might be in different positions depending on different issues, and on some issues there is a stark difference between being an Atlanticist and being a Europeanist, right? There is sometimes a very stark difference here. Whether there is a difference or not, that's I guess an empirical question we're trying to answer as well. And on the last question, this table, the table, which I didn't want to pay too much attention to it anyway, but the table was not is not meant to capture positions in other places. It's meant to capture positions within the EU, right? So there's no need for the U.S. Atlanticists to be forced to be in line with what European Atlanticists would be for in each of these cells. But we also try to unpack the concept of strategic autonomy, and in that particular cell, those who in Europe want a strategic autonomy while being Atlanticists because they perceive that the world is fragmenting, and hence they would like to make a contribution. That's why they want to be strategic autonomy. It's one particular kind of strategic autonomy. We differentiate three different kinds of it, and that one is autonomy two, strategic autonomy two. It's strategic autonomy as responsibility, as a way to make a contribution to the broader Western alliance. It's not strategic. It's not autonomy from the US or China. It's strategic autonomy to have more capabilities to be able to make a larger contribution to an alliance that is not the EU itself, but it's much broader. From that's one of the ways in which strategic autonomy is used in political discourse, and of course it differs completely from other political ways in which it is used, and it is very much in line with what some people from it's not the French way to talk about this, but it is certainly the place in which strategic autonomy is talked about in the way in which strategic autonomy is talked about in other places in Europe. And of course, that is very much in line with what a US Atlanticist would like the EU to do, right? Which is to be more able to make an autonomous contribution to a more strategic Western alliance. So that would be my answer to the two questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I hand over for the final question. And I would like to ask for short questions and short answers so that we can grab a coffee or still have time.
It will be very short, actually, just to, I will not repeat, I guess that it were great questions that were raised. And so it just regarding the presentation of Knud, I guess there is no contradiction or opposition with what you were saying. I guess that, yes, I guess security studies, international law, humanitarian law has grown exponentially, and IR theories. But I guess that the problem that you were pointing out is well taken, that EU studies or European studies somehow neglected the question of war.
because the inherent, I mean, the cause of European studies was about how to produce institutions. And war was not present. And I guess that's a vacuum. And I guess it's important to resort to other fields somehow to respond that. And I guess there's a research project there. You know, how Europe, not the EU, Europe has been affected by external wars in general from the decolonization process, because there's extensive literature about CFSP and all that, but that is EU institutions. But there's something that hasn't been explored. And I guess that's a great area to explore. I remember the USA conference in Boston that we were talking about, that back then, 10 years ago, the crisis of EU studies was that EU studies was moving into economics, you know? So, but war hasn't been there. And I wouldn't say war, I guess that violent conflicts, how it's affecting Europe. So I guess that there is no contradiction and actually complementarity. Very briefly, the normative EU externally does not resonate that much. In the US does not resonate that much, you know, and it's not taken really seriously, the normative Europe, you know, nor in Canada, in Latin America, somehow there's skepticism. And I guess I like what was mentioned, you know, Europe externally, internally is very important, the concept of normative Europe, but externally, I guess that Europe is what it does externally. And from that angle, I guess that Europe started being geopolitical, geoeconomic a long time ago, even before the 2008 crisis, you know. And from that angle, I guess that, yes, I fully agree that the normative Europe externally is dead, or has been dead for a while. And that basically, well, just to conclude, the issue of liberalism, I guess that sometimes, and is related to the normative Europe, there is no ownership of liberalism and the liberal order. There are different implementations and practices of liberalism around the world, even in authoritarian states. If we consider that there are an economic liberalism and political liberalism, liberalism somehow is there. We are in a bad moment. No question about it. Erosion of democracy, somehow, again, some neo-protectionism, but the fundamentals are there. Here, what I would like to point out is that there are many practices of liberalism around the world. And in that regard, I guess that the liberal order, there are different versions, and the European liberal order, or Europe in that liberal order, should be understood in other normative references. The United States, it's a liberal, it's part of that liberal order. And now, to some extent, a normative reference, China. We shouldn't neglect that, you know. And only then we can understand the normative power of Europe in the context of the other elephants in the room. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Who wants to? You don't have to. I think that's still a great statement to grab a coffee, and then I think we should be back in like 20 minutes. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the first great panel.